Hey guys, it's Mount Walk, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about Dreadstill. That's right, this sweet old legacy deck that has its roots in a bunch of different decks, some of them from Vintage. This is another Premodern deck, pretty sweet. I like it quite a bit. I mean, you get to beat down with 12-12 or just random dorks. I mean, both those things I really like. So let's let's go ahead and get to it. So it's very similar to the old vintage fish decks, the ones played like Cloud of Faeries and Standstill and Wasteland and Mishra's Factory. It was basically like kind of an aggro control deck, but more similar. Um, well, obviously to the actual Dreadstill lists from Legacy, and it's pretty sweet. You get to play pretty much a mostly Legacy version of this deck, so it's a little worse, but still pretty powerful for this format. Um, and even though it looks superficially similar to Landstill, the other uh, you know Standstill like Manland deck, it plays a lot different because well, it kind of plays like an aggro control game, has more tempo cards, stuff like, stuff that pushes it in the tempo direction, like Lightning Bolt and Fire and Ice and things like that. Daze, of course, is a big one. So yeah, superficially similar to Landstill, but not exactly the same thing. And it's like I said, it's a pretty strong deck, and I mean, free 12/12s is pretty sweet. So it's sometimes difficult to try and, I guess, hate the deck out because like trying to beat it, you got all these different things you got to interact with, like the lands and then all the card drawing and the giant 12/12s and then the little dorks and so on and so forth. So it does feel really strong, which is really nice. Um, and I think that's a pretty big draw to the deck. But what does it look like? Looks like this. And so this is basically, I mean, the main deck is like really close to another one of the decks that was being played in Europe, and I can't remember. It was on TC decks. I think it was like into sometime around December. I was like, wow, this list looks really good. Um, Again, I like the 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 five stifle effects because um, five was what I found was actually really good or good enough. I mean, obviously you played something like Trickbind instead in Legacy, but obviously you can't play that here. You can play something like Interdict. Now that might be interesting, but having a one mana one is pretty nice. I think I like it more than the card draw in Interdict, although um, well, it depends, but it's another option to think about. So yeah, I don't want to take credit for more or less designing the deck or anything. I did see it from a European thing on TC decks. I can't remember what one it was. They all have these European names. It's very difficult to remember. Oh my gosh. But anyways, like I said, most of the main deck's pretty much all the same. I liked it a lot, and then Sideboard's a little different. But yeah, I mean this is basically acts like an aggro control deck for the most part. You do have like counterspell for a little bit, if you want to be more hard control. You can draw quite a few cards, so that's pretty sweet. And of course, the dazes and the lightning bolts are pretty awesome. But the greatest thing is this deck can play Stifle, and Stifle is like awesome. It can be a little inconsistent, but you pretty much always have targets either in their deck or your deck or whatnot. Obviously, you can stifle their fetch lands, which is great because it helps with the mana denial element, along with like burning their birds and stuff like that. You also can so yeah, you get their lands, obviously, so the wastelands, dust bowls, and of course the fetch lands like I just mentioned. You can hit things like the Vinral's Disc or Deed, although stifling a disc only stops it for a turn. Um, let's see, obviously all sorts of creature abilities, something like a Hermit Druid or whatever. There's so many things you can do with it, and obviously not even counting the Phyrexian Dreadnought and Stifle combo, which is just awesome. I mean, that is so much fun. It's just so cheap. Like I mean, literally in every sense of the word, you know, just like, oh, turn two, like blam, stifle dreadnought, boom. It just feels pretty silly. Actually, probably my favorite play on the turn, or the favorite sequence, would be like first turn, like um, Mistress Factory, turn two, Island, Cloud of Fairies, Standstill. I mean, that's like bam, that's sweet. So like even if they do like immediately pop it, you don't have to discard, and it's just so good. And it's like getting those two dudes ready to freaking go, and then you have like creatures, a bunch of dudes under the standstill, so you're already pressuring them. That's awesome. That's like really sweet. That's one of my favorite parts of the deck. Oh, excuse me. And of course you get the portent and the standstill. Portent basically acting like a pseudo brainstorm thing, a little bit worse. Um, but it's obviously it's a lot slower, and it's only sorcery suit, but it's pretty good. It's pretty good. Always like portent. It digs a lot deeper than something like sleight of hand or opt or whatever. Um, and then fire ice is sweet. Of course, I mean you can. I mean it does everything, and it's never dead. It can help with the mana denial. You can kill their birds and elves, or you can kill their weenie dudes that are attacking you. You can ice like their lands during their upkeep and it card pops. You can tap their like Ravenous Baloth or something. I mean, it does so much. It's one of my favorite cards ever, and it's very good in this deck. Days again good with like the Stifle and Waste plan if you're trying to mana screw them. So Days plays into that very well, especially when you're putting a lot of pressure on them. Like you need to kill the dreadnought by like next turn, or it's going to kill you. So they'll have to play into Days half the time. So that's pretty strong. Vision Charm has other modes. I don't know if I would ever use them, but they are there, so that's kind of interesting. And then, yeah, like the the mana in this deck is just gonna, I mean, bunch of islands and mountains and ship and reefs and waste and mistress factories. I mean, it's what you would expect in a blue-red deck. Yeah, even if the wastes aren't, if they're playing like a monocolor deck or something, you can still use them to activate the mistress factories. So the sideboard is, I mean, just a lot of good stuff. Power Blast, Hydro Blast, Tormod's Crypt, nothing too strange about that. Powder Keg again against a lot of the weenie decks and other random cheap things. Rushing River against permanents, Submerge against green decks. Depending on what's in your metagame, I think will definitely shape how you make your sideboard. I think for this deck especially. But again, that shouldn't be too unusual. More or less what you're doing for a lot of decks. So this deck has an interesting playstyle. So like I said, basically functions like an aggro control deck, sometimes like a control deck in some situations, but also, of course, it has the combo element with Dreadnought and Stifle. So it can be a little bit difficult to try and figure out what kind of thing you're trying to do against a lot of aggro decks, especially those without any answers main deck or very few answers main deck. Just jamming the Dreadnought on turn 2 is actually fine. Just make them answer it, and if they don't, then they just die. And you give them like 2 turns. So, I mean, that's sometimes the best thing to do. It depends on the matchup, though. So it is hard if you're playing against decks where you don't know what they're playing, or it's kind of like a rogue thing. So that does add another element of difficulty. And like I said earlier, Stifle is sweet. It just does so much. It's basically never dead. You don't want to draw like 100 of them, but like stifling their land, and then the next one you can get rid of your Dreadnought's drawback. Like, that's pretty sweet. And another thing is that there's not a ton of artifact hate, it seems, outside of like Naturalize and Disenchant. Like, there does seem to be those floating around, but not that much in comparison. So that's pretty good. I like that you're a little less vulnerable to that than you would imagine. I mean, this doesn't seem like, unless there's a bunch of Tinker decks or Wildfire decks, there's not a lot of artifact hate, or at least, like, you're not going to be fighting any crumbles and cheap stuff like that. So that's kind of nice. That's a nice little bonus. But like I said, depends on your local metagame, what's gonna be good and what people are packing. So just be sure to keep that in mind. But the deck really wants Brainstorm and Force of Will, like Force especially, because Portland kind of does the Brainstorm thing a little bit. Um, but Brainstorm would be good because then you just play like 8 fetch lands or whatever, and 7 or 8 fetch lands in your islands and yada yada yada. But Force is really nice because it's a free counter. You don't have to worry about it. Late game, you don't have, like, where Daze is not very good. Obviously Force would be. And you don't always have, like, you can't tap out, obviously, with Counterspell and keep up protection. So Force would be really nice. So you do miss those cards a lot. Force especially because just of all the crap that people can, like the plows and stuff like that, that would be very difficult to daze. So there are problems with the deck, though, or at least problem cards. So there are a lot of things, like I said earlier, that there are some permanents that are difficult to deal with, and I want to emphasize on how important it can be to shape your sideboard to what you're expecting. For example, if you're getting like stuff like Enchantress, you'll want stuff like Annuls in there, and Annul is very good against, well, stuff like Enchantress or any of the land tax stacks, things like that. And you only have, like, if they're like resolve like a solitary confinement or something, you only have the 2 rushing rivers in the sideboard to deal with them. And the same thing with something like big fat green creatures. You have no answer to it other than hitting them with a dreadnought. And if you can't do that, or they destroy it, or if you can't race it or whatever, that could be in trouble. You could be in big trouble there. That's why the smurges are there in the sideboard. And like I said, yeah, so you can have issues with random stuff. If you don't know what's coming your way, then you're gonna have a bad time. The deck is a little inconsistent, because you don't have you do have the A and B combo thing, and so if you're drawing too many dreadnoughts and no stifles or whatever, like that's gonna be a bad time. Uh, but you do have some card draw to sort of fix it up, and so it's not too bad, but it can be an issue, especially when, like, people start playing more hate and, like, you start drawing all these dreadnoughts and they got like a seal of cleansing in play, and you're just like, well, that's not good. So yeah, but I think Annul is one of the cards I really want in the sideboard at some point. And like a bunch of other stuff, things like Pyroclasm, which is better against a lot of the weenie decks, pretty much all of them. But you don't really want to kill your own guys, which is kind of crappy. It's fine with Dreadnought in play, obviously, but you don't really want to kill your Grim Lavamancer. So there's other things like Sea Sprite that I really wanted. I didn't even know that card was was legal, but I always forget that Homelands is like after Ice Age and before Alliances, I think. So Sea Sprite's old fish tech that they used against a lot of the red decks. Or you could play Sukata Firemancer? Fire guy? It's like a 2 or 3 mana 0/1 pro red tap to deal damage to a creature player. That thing's okay. But I think that was 3 mana. So there's all sorts of different options that I don't exactly know what would be best against all these different decks. So it's a little tough to say, but fortunately sometimes you can just play a Dreadnought on turn 2 and not have to think too much about it. So there you go. That's pretty much it. This is a sweet deck. It's pretty fun. I like it a lot. I hope you guys like it too. There's not much better than resolving a Dreadnought on turn 2 or just chaining Cloud of Faeries. The Cloud of Faeries is like one of my favorite cards because it just does everything. It's free. It cycles if it's bad. It flies. It has sweet art. I mean, that's it. That's all she wrote. You don't need anything more than that. So that's it for today, guys. Thanks for tuning in, and have a good day.